Hey guys, welcome and thanks for joining me today. So, today we're going to be discussing in Luke 6 what it means to be compassionate over following the rules. I'll see you in a minute. Hey, welcome to Bible 365. I'm your host, Kathy Carter, and this channel is here to kind of merge Bible living with Bible literacy. So, we are going to be using the New Testament this year in order to understand what it's like to live as a follower of Christ. I have a link below in the description that I have a download that will bring you to a chronological Bible reading of the New Testament. So, what I want you to do is read every day and join me and hopefully some friends as we talk about what it means to live as a kingdom builder. Let's get started. Hey, and welcome. We're going to be discussing Luke 6 today. And at the beginning of the week, I try and do just a little bit of history, which isn't too much because we haven't been that far. But where we've been so far is that Jesus was born and John was born. John, we call him John the Baptist, so who has heralded in Jesus and let everybody know he was coming. He was baptized in the Jordan along with so many other people. And then he was out and he was tempted by Satan. Once he was tempted and he passed that temptation, he then started his ministry and he went into his own hometown, let them know that the prophecy of Isaiah has come true. They didn't believe him. They kind of chased him out a little bit. And then he started healing paralytics and sick people. And so this really, and taking out demons, this really was the start of his ministry. So what we would call his ministry. And so where we find ourselves today is in Luke 6. And one of the things that I want to focus on today, and this might be a two-parter video, so I'm going to see how long it runs and I might break it out into two pieces. But what I want to focus on in the beginning of this video is I'm going to show a little clip. And this is a clip of Dennis Prager and Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson did this Christian podcast kind of thing on the Gospels. And one of the things that they discussed was essentially outward behavior. And so I think that this is really interesting that Jesus gets to the heart of this. So after this clip, we are going to discuss the beginning of Luke 6.
I come from a behaviorist, law-based religion. We care how you act. That's why we don't have a claim that if you look at another woman with lust, it's as if you've committed adultery with her.
Okay, so where we find ourselves in Luke 6 is it says, now it happened he was passing through some grain fields on the Sabbath. As he's passing through these grain fields, him and his disciples are, and disciples means like these people were following him. So he was teaching, he was going around, he was healing, and there were people that were following him. And we can see that he's picked out some people to actually come with him. And we're going to see a little more of that later. But people were listening to what he was saying. So it's just thinking about what that would look like now, like what people and followers look like. And I always bring up, because just it's an easy one, is Taylor Swift, right? Like what a follower of Taylor Swift would look like, right? They would go to her concerts. They would download and buy all of her music. They would listen like and kind of internalize her lyrics. They would dress like her. They would maybe give to the same charities that she gives to, right? So these are people who would be following. This is what it would look like then. So now it probably looks a little bit different. We have cars, we have entertainment different. But then, right, they would have literally followed him to places. So he would have gone from temple to temple, right? And we see he was outside teaching. And so these people would maybe have their day's work, and on their Sabbath day, instead of going to their synagogue, they would go and they would find him and they would follow him and they would listen to his teachings. Wherever it is he would go, they would follow him. So we have these followers or disciples, these people who were learning underneath of him and following him. This was definitely a way of the world. This wouldn't have been something that would have been considered unusual. Anyway, so as he's going around, they're eating. So they're kind of like they're as they walk past fields, they're picking these little heads of grain and they're eating them because it's a Sunday and they're hungry and they haven't made food and they're eating them. Well, for those of you who have been, maybe were in the Old Testament or follow any kind of Jewish history, on the Sabbath, they follow this system that there is no working, there is no cooking, there is no turning on of the lights. So they follow this huge system of rest on the Sabbath, which we now call the sun on Sunday, but for them it was a Saturday. So there was rest on the Sabbath. So they would have done nothing. All they did was walk themselves to temple and sit in the hearing of whoever it was that was teaching at temple. They didn't do anything else. And there were other things that were actually considered to be really bad to do. And taking grain was actually considered work. And if we go back to some of these stories in the Old Testament, we see that God actually punished when someone worked. So they showed someone out that was chopping wood. And when they were out chopping wood, they actually wound up dying because they weren't supposed to be working on the Sabbath. He was taking that to be a really holy day. The sons of Aaron were brought out the little censers, right? The little bowls that would have the incense in it. And they weren't supposed to do that. So they were burned immediately because they were doing things on the Sabbath that they were not supposed to be doing. It was a day that was supposed to be holy. This day was set apart from other days. And so I want to be clear that this would have been considered a really bad thing. And it wouldn't have been ridiculous to have been considered a bad thing. So when we look at it and we go, they're picking grains of hay, like who cares? We have all kinds of things open on our what we would consider our Sabbath day. So we wouldn't consider it that. We have to look into the eyes of the individual in which Jesus was speaking to and to understand what they're saying, right? So what they're saying is the Lord said to us, do not do any work on the Sabbath, right? And therefore we don't do any work. And yet we look at your guys and your guys are doing work on the Sabbath. They're picking and they're eating. So that's actually considered work. All right. So like sort of like laying that foundation. So they were understandably so. God gave them a list of rules and they were like, these rules are what's important. And you are breaking the fine details of these rules as we've laid them out, as we've seen that God has laid them out. And so Jesus now kind of turns everything on their heads. Jesus answers them and says, have you not even read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions. So this is what Jesus is doing first. So remember, the Jewish community as a whole, what's outside matters. What's inside doesn't count. What's outside matters. So when they work on the outside, that matters. That's a rule, and that takes precedence over everything else. And what Jesus is saying, hey, do you remember when David did this? Do you remember when David, and this was back in Samuel, remember when David was running from Saul? And this would have been really important because David was one of their most important people that they looked up to. David was the one that they thought was coming back. So it was extremely important to note that David would have been sort of like the pinnacle for them. So he said, do you remember David was running? David had a whole bunch of his men with him and he had no food. And do you remember he went to that priest and he said to him, I have no food. And he took the consecrated bread. I also want to note that if you read the Old Testament with me, or if you've just read it before, David wasn't completely honest to the priest. So this would have been a breaking of the law. So David wasn't completely honest, and he wound up getting this consecrated bread that by law was only for the priest to eat. And the priest was like kind of freaking out a little bit. He didn't want to give this to David, but David was like, I'm starving. I've been sent and I need to eat this bread. So he didn't tell him that he was running. So, and he was given the bread. The priest actually wound up giving him the bread. Point being, right? David, who was your most important king, was in desperation at the time. He needed this bread. He was being chased by the bad guy, by the villain, Saul. And so he needed this bread. So what took precedence? The law, right? According to David, the law, or his desperate need, right? Would God have been compassionate about his desperate need? And I think what Jesus is saying to them, right, is that I don't want to say the law can be broken because that's not really the point. The point is that compassion is ultimately God's design. God put these laws in place, right? For them to join in community and look separate and uniquely different. And he's saying like they're eating because they're starving. Like they need to eat food. It's the Sabbath and we're walking around. And he said, the Sabbath doesn't own the people. The people own the Sabbath. He says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So that means that Jesus makes the rules on the Sabbath, and his compassion for his people, because they are with him, overwhelms the law and the rule of the Sabbath. And I want to say that because then it goes, well, then can we break any rule? Does that just mean like nothing really matters? Right. And I think this is a really big question, because I think overwhelmingly, and we try and build a foundation on rules, which I really understand, and I think that there is important. The older I get, the more important I actually think this is. The more I come to understand why church systems create a series of things that they need to follow, right? Like these are the rules that we fall under. These are the umbrellas. Some of the other things we don't worry so much about, but these are the umbrellas we fall under. So then they have order in their system. And I completely understand that. And I do think that that's really important. But love for others and compassion and putting the Lord first overrides all of those things. Boy, even as I say it, I feel like as it comes out, it feels like in a way sacrilegious to say, but this is what Jesus is saying. And this is why they're so bothered by it, because they're like, what we have known and what the Lord has been telling us is this. And then you come in and you break those things. And so now how are we supposed to believe that you're the Son of the Lord when you're not doing all of the perfect rules in which he tells you to do? And he's saying the Lord is over those rules, right? The Lord creates those rules. And I am here as the Lord. And I am telling you that compassion, when necessary, is more important than sacrifice. All right, we're going to move down to this, because then we follow up on him healing on the Sabbath. So this kind of falls under that same line, right? So he is healing on the Sabbath, which again is a huge no-no. And so they bring this person in because very specifically they want to see what Jesus is going to do. Is this guy really going to follow all our rules and be the perfect Son of God? Or is he going to break the rules? And he does the same exact thing. And he follows up and he says, and it says, they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do with him. So instead of hearing what he had to say, watching because they were watching him, but they didn't watch all of the things he did with a heart towards the Lord. They watched it with a heart towards their rules. And I'm going to say, like, we still get stuck in this pattern all the time. And so if I'm going to say, like, what does this mean to us? How does this matter? It's our hearts that are the most important thing. The sincerity of loving the Lord in our hearts. And sometimes I want to be completely honest with you. I think sometimes we're going to get it wrong, but I do think that the Lord has compassion for those things. And I want to follow up in this verse. In verse 45, and we're going to come back to it later, but in verse 45 it says, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil, for his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. So we're going to have this kind of list of rules coming up in a little bit, but it's all about what is on the inside. The outside just follows suit on what's on the inside. And I know I kind of broke this a lot last year. I kept saying it over and over again, but I think that this is in some ways the heart of Jesus's message, is that you thought I gave you rules to be on the outside. And in some ways I did, but it was all about trying to work on what's on the inside. Those rules were supposed to follow what's coming and stemming from the inside. It wasn't supposed to change the outside image of you, but what's on the inside. I'm actually going to show this clip too. There's this movie with Jack Black and Gwyneth Paltrow, and it's an older movie, and it's funny enough how sometimes movies get it right when so many other things get it wrong. He gets this wish that he just wants to see the good in people, and because he's like horrible and all he sees are like hot girls and he doesn't care about what they're like or their personalities, and then he winds up only seeing, like, he sees the beauty, what's on the inside, he actually sees that on the outside. And so it's in some ways a lesson to us that it needs to stem internally, that the outside actually reflects what is inside. And so what the outside does, again, I'm going to say it's not that it doesn't matter, but it is all about what's on the inside that counts. In our next section, we see Jesus is bringing all of the 12 disciples. So what I wanted to note about this that I thought was really interesting, it says at the time he went off to the mountain to pray. So he spends the whole night in prayer with God, and then he comes and chooses his disciples. Here's what he says. He says he calls his disciples to him. Now at this point, he possibly has hundreds of disciples, people following him. We know he has a lot. So there are a lot of people that are following him from place to place. And so he calls them all to him. And this is a thing that, again, we've seen from the Old Testament, what God does for his people. God calls his people to him. And this is very literal how Jesus does it. God does it in many different ways. So with a lot of them, like, so to Abraham, he would call him and say, I want you to go here, right? So he was calling to him, drawing him to him, and telling him he wanted to do certain things. Sometimes he would visit some of them, like he visited Isaac and he visited Jacob. And so we would see him do that. So he would call to them. Now, this is what Jesus is doing, very literally. Call my disciples and bring them to me. When I bring my disciples to me, I choose 12 of those disciples, right? So he chooses 12, and the 12 that he chooses, he gives them a job. So he chooses these 12 out of all of his disciples. So all the people that are following him, he says, come to me. And then he says, there are 12 of you that I now want to be apostles. I want you guys to now be the ones that go out, right? You have a very special, specific, particular job. And that's what he calls his 12 apostles to do. And so then he lists the 12 apostles that he calls to him. And now that's where we're ending today. And if this has been a blessing to you, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.